Around the beginning of the 20th century, the fictional books of Jules Verne and H. G. Wells on the moon landings were published. Here we have the photos of the covers of two old comic magazines with adaptations of these books. From 1950, many speculations began about men going to the moon and Mars. Here we have images of two movie posters from that era on this topic. In this video we will show you the main space travel projects made by Wernher von Braun or inspired by him until 1961. These projects created in the United States the illusion that they were viable. Space travel would start with men going to the moon, but that never happened, as we are demonstrating in this video series. Wernher von Braun, born in 1912 and died in 1977, was a German engineer whose 1945 photo appears here. He belonged to the Nazi Party and the SS, and was primarily responsible for the development of the German V-2 missile, shown here.
In 1944, Germany implemented a plan to drop a radioactive bomb on New York. The country was losing the war, but the Nazis still was creating new weapons. 3 aerospace engineers, among them von Braun, were tasked with developing this program. They designed, tested, and manufactured the missiles, using mainly prisoner labor. However, before they used, the war ended in 1945, with the defeat of Germany. Several space engineers went to the United States, not as prisoners, but to use their knowledge to develop rockets. Though von Braun participated in the plan cited, over time he became a national hero of the United States.
In 1948, von Braun wrote a text about 10 spacecraft, with 70 crew members, in a round trip to Mars. The technical part of this text was published in 1952, in a book written in German, whose cover appears here. On the left side. On the right side, appears the book published in English, in 1953, and its title is, The Mars Project. This is an illustration, with all the ships described in von Braun's book, approaching Mars, depicted in red. Let's classify the cited book as semi-fiction. In the same ranking are also some unfeasible ideas, proposed by von Braun, which were accepted as possible, only because he was considered the foremost expert on the subject. In 1950, the newspaper Huntsville Times, in the town where von Braun lived, published this headline: Dr. von Braun says rocket flights possible to moon. Between 1952 and 1954, Collier's Weekly magazine published, in 8 issues, a series of articles by von Braun and 4 other specialists, on the conquest of space. The space station envisioned by von Braun, seen here, would have a diameter of 76 meters, and would circle the Earth at 1,700 kilometers of altitude at 25,500 kilometers per hour. In this, and other articles by von Braun, there are images of the crew, walking and working, as if they were on Earth. The space station would be built piece by piece, carried by cargo rockets. The rocket, seen here, would have 3 stages, with the total height of a 24-story building. 3 spacecraft, imagined by von Braun, would make the first manned trip to the Moon, after leaving the space station. 2 spacecrafts would carry a total of 40 men, having propellant for omission. The third spacecraft would carry 10 men and all supplies and equipment. The spacecrafts would reach a speed of 31,000 kilometers per hour about 33 minutes after departure. Then the thrusters would be turned off, thus going close to the Moon, when they would be turned on again, for the landing. At the top of the spacecrafts, would be a huge 6-story sphere, for the crew. Let's consider this as semi-fiction, due to the exaggerated amount of spacecrafts, and people, on a first trip to the Moon. The image shows some rockets, devised by von Braun. He changed his concepts of spacecraft several times. Von Braun went to work at Disney Studios, initially to release 3 films about space exploration, with the help of future NASA scientists. The films started with cartoons, and later showed von Braun's explanations. The first film was Man in Space, with its poster displayed on the left side. Von Braun appears on the right. The film was presented on TV in 1955, obtaining large audience. Image of the poster for the film, Man and the Moon, also from 1955, about a manned space trip, imagined by von Braun, that would go around the Moon, and then return.
This is an image from the cited film, showing this scene, which we consider poorly explained. It shows when a rocket appears flying, and then stops, presumably to represent being synchronized with the space station. Then, a capsule appears, approaching to make a coupling. If it were real, would be very dangerous. Now we show that scene.
Ladies and gentlemen, through a worldwide network of radio and television, we are bringing you an on-the-spot account of the first expedition around the Moon. Here at Space Station number 1, 1,000 miles above the Earth, the final preparations have all been made. Except for the time the rocket is on the other side of the Moon, our radio and that of the station will be in constant communication with the ship during the 10-day voyage. As the moon ship stands by, the all-important pressurized spacesuit enters the rocket's airlock for the last time. During the trip, it'll be used only in the case of emergency. The captain is the last man to come aboard. He will direct the entire expedition from his position at the front of the ship. The navigator with his specialized instruments is responsible for plotting the unmarked path through space. The radio operator must maintain constant communication with the Earth on the space station. Finally, the rocket ship's motor and other mechanical functions will be the responsibility of the engineer.
The image on the left is from the Disney film, Mars and Beyond, presented in 1957, about a mission to the planet Mars. On the right is a drawing of a strange spacecraft with a disk. We note that the force that moves it could cause an additional rotating movement around the center of gravity, affecting the maneuvers. There would be 6 spacecrafts that would travel at 160,000 kilometers per hour. After a few months of traveling and staying on Mars, they would return to Earth. See one scene of the film.
This atomic electric spaceship features a revolutionary new principle that will make possible the long trip to Mars with only a small expenditure of fuel. Parts for the spaceship will be brought up to an orbit by conventional chemical fuel rockets. It will then be assembled in the vacuum of space. This unusual ship will be 500 feet across and will carry a small landing craft for the final descent to the Martian surface. Located at the bottom is a small atomic reactor which furnishes a continuous supply of heat. This heat turns silicon oil into steam. After rising up a central pipe, the steam drives a turbo generator which produces electricity to run the ship. The steam is condensed in a giant circular cooler and used over and over again. In the thrust chamber, a platinum grid is electrically charged. The metallic element cesium is vaporized and blown through the white-hot grid. This ionizes the cesium atoms, and they are then electrically blasted out into space at the rate of billions per second. This thrust pushes the ship in the opposite direction. The atomic electric spaceship can operate continuously for a period of years. At the top of the ship, away from the dangerous atomic reactor, is cargo space and quarters for a crew of 20 men. Mounted outside on the thrust chamber assembly is the auxiliary landing craft. When our ship reaches Mars, the landing craft will be released, carrying men and supplies to the planet's surface. A drag chute will gradually slow the landing craft as it streaks into the Martian atmosphere. A few seconds before touching down, the main rocket motors will be fired and the craft will land gently on its nose. Later, the exploration party can return to the mothership by blasting off in the tail section of the landing craft. Here is the plan for our trip to Mars. It will take 13 months and 6 days. Starting 1,000 miles above the Earth, the spaceship will slowly accelerate for 4 months before escaping the Earth's gravity. For the next 7 months, the ship will follow a curved path, finally entering the gravitational field of Mars. An additional 2 months will be spent spiraling into a circular orbit 620 miles above the Martian surface. Here at the space station, our journey begins. The expedition is comprised of 6 ships. Time, a few minutes before departure.
Between 1950 and 1956, von Braun commanded an Army rocket development team, resulting in the Redstone Rocket. In 1955, he became an American naturalized citizen. In 1956, he was appointed technical director of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, established in Huntsville, Alabama. The photo shows von Braun in 1957. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik 1 satellite, seen here, and in November it launched Sputnik 2, with the female dog, Laika. The launch of the American Vanguard satellite was not successful. In January 1958, the Explorer 1 satellite successfully entered orbit. These launches were part of the International Geophysical Year, which aimed at cooperation between nations, but became a competition, starting the so-called space race. Missile Man, von Braun. This text appeared on the cover of Time magazine, on February 17, 1958, seen here. He deserved the title, for presenting, at the time, some impracticable ideas about the military use of rockets and satellites.
The following text is from the book quoted on the screen. On April 17, 1958, von Braun and Medaries told the House Committee on Science and Astronautics that the United States should develop the capability to move soldiers and materials quickly to the wars of the future. Their proposal was, put 3 or 4 soldiers into the nose cone of a rocket, so an instant army could arrive from the sky to attack some remote local. The idea made no sense, but, coming from von Braun, it seemed to the rocket enthusiasts like gospel.
The Lunix Project was a 1958 study by the United States Air Force to send manned expeditions to create an underground base for 21 people on the Moon. The project was announced in 1961, 4 days after President Kennedy announced his intention to send men to the Moon. After that, nothing more was officially said about it. The Lumen Project, of the United States Air Force, started in 1958. The objective was to send a rocket with 3 astronauts to land on the Moon, and, after some tasks, return to Earth. The project ceased after the announcement of the creation of NASA. The A-119 was a 1958 project of the U.S. Air Force for detonating an atomic bomb on the Moon that would be visible to the naked eye from Earth. The project was quickly cancelled, mainly due to likely negative popular reaction. The Mallard Project, from 1959, was developed by the Chance Vought Company, contracted by NASA, and which consisted of a rocket with modules that would take 3 astronauts to the Moon. The project had some changes, and was renamed Mallard, which gave rise to the system that was used by the Apollo project.
This is an artistic conception of the Horizon Project, from 1959, which was developed by von Braun's group, at the Army's Ballistic Missile Agency, with the aim of setting up a both scientific and military base on the Moon. It would take 147 Saturn A1 rockets to carry components and assemble a space station in orbit around the Earth, which would launch the rockets to the Moon, with 16 astronauts on each mission. The President Eisenhower rejected the project. Now we present 5 more artistic conceptions of the project, made at the time, about constructions that would be made on the Moon.
The Nova rocket was a project of the Air Force of the United States, aimed to send a manned spacecraft to the Moon. As the illustration shows, it would be the biggest and heaviest rocket. However, in 1961, the NASA decided to use the Saturn V rocket in the Apollo program. Even so, studies on the Nova rocket continued and, starting in 1962, 3 companies in the aeronautical field presented their versions, which resulted in some huge rocket projects, also aimed at their use in a manned mission to Mars. NASA was created in July 1958, with the aim of bringing together space projects that were being developed by the military. Engineer Robert Gilroth, seen here, took charge of Project Mercury, aimed at putting an astronaut into Earth orbit. He was developing a similar project at NACA, which was merged into NASA. Part of the Army's designs and personnel also passed to NASA. In 1960, NASA opened the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. Von Braun, with the Army team, went for there. In the first half of 1959, NASA formed a group of 10 engineers, from different departments, to debate the issue of space travel. The final report mentioned that, plans for manned trips to the Moon should be started, and that this would be a kind of preparation for manned interplanetary travel. Still in 1959, George Low, that was NASA's chief of manned spaceflight, planned to use the Saturn rocket in missions to land on the Moon. A group, led by von Braun, had been studying manned missions to the Moon since 1957. During the latter half of 1959, von Braun also studied the possibility of using the Saturn rocket for manned and unmanned lunar landing missions.
A manned satellite, for orbiting the Moon, could be launched from the Earth's surface, but with the current state of the art, some other technique will have to be used for a manned lunar landing. That was the conclusion of a 1959 report, which reached the same conclusion as another earlier report. The intention was to put an end to useless speculation about human spaceflight, aiming to land on the Moon. Despite the 1959 report stating, in other words, that NASA did not know how to perform a manned moon landing, von Braun returned to the topic in 1960, when he published the book, First Men to the Moon. The rocket would have 5 stages, as shown in the images. We can see from the images that there is not a reasonable proportion between the initial and final stages of the rocket, compared to the set used in Apollo 11, for example, where the initial stages were much larger. This disproportion becomes more evident when we consider an article in Life magazine from April 1962. The article explains that, with the rockets existing at the time, the ratio between the total weight to land on the Moon and the weight of fuel needed in the rocket for a mission would be 1 to 100.
In July 1960, NASA announced the Apollo program. From September 1960 to May 1961, 3 companies were selected to design manned spacecrafts for flying around the Moon, but leaving open the possibility of a lunar landing. At the same time, NASA continued with its own projects on this topic. The companies presented their projects, but they did not continue, as John Kennedy, who was elected president, decided in May 1961 that the priority would be to send men to land on the Moon.